plantation records from northeastern Alabama reveal an entry that defies explanation. Men, armed, trained, and authorized by law failed to restrain a single individual. The incident report buried in county archives for over a century describes wounds that shouldn't have been survivable. A display of resistance that medical experts of the era deemed physiologically impossible, and an aftermath so disturbing that overseers resigned within days. Never speaking of what they witnessed. The plantation owner ordered all documentation sealed, paying families substantial sums for their silence. What actually happened on the Harrington estate that spring morning wasn't supernatural. It was something far more terrifying. A truth about human capability that threatened the entire foundation of Southern society. If you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and impossible legend, subscribe to this channel. We love hearing where our community discovers these forgotten American stories. The incident at Harrington Plantation didn't emerge from nowhere. To understand what transpired, you must first understand the man, the place, and the carefully constructed system that both created and feared him. Harrington Plantation sprawled across acres of Alabama bottomland, where the Tallapoosa River carved through red clay hills thick with oak and pine. Established by Colonel Marcus Harrington, a veteran of the Creek War, the estate had grown into one of the county's most profitable cotton operations. It sustained enslaved individuals, produced bales annually, and employed white overseers, an unusually high number that locals attributed to Colonel Harrington's meticulous management style. The plantation house stood on a rise overlooking the fields. But the true heart of the operation lay in the quarters. Colonel Harrington ran his plantation with mathematical precision, keeping detailed records of every bushel picked, every hour worked, every punishment administered. Jacob Terrel arrived at Harrington Plantation in the autumn. Purchased at a Richmond auction for a staggering sum. The auction house documents describe him as of a certain age, remarkable in height and weight, with a remarkable physical constitution, previous employment in iron foundry work and timber operations, no history of resistance or difficulty. What the documents didn't mention was that Jacob had spent his entire life in industrial labor rather than agricultural work. Born on an iron plantation, he'd worked the furnaces and forges from a young age, developing not the lean endurance of field hands, but the dense compact strength of industrial laborers. His previous owner had sold him not for discipline problems, but for economic reasons. Colonel Harrington bought Jacob specifically for the most demanding physical tasks on the plantation. For years, Jacob performed these duties without incident. He spoke little, worked efficiently, and drew no particular attention. But something changed in the winter. Martha Clemens, the plantation's head cook, later told her granddaughter that Jacob had received news that autumn. A letter had somehow reached him, though enslaved people were forbidden from receiving correspondence. The letter's contents were never confirmed, but Martha recalled seeing Jacob standing motionless behind the cookhouse one evening, a piece of paper in his hands, his face transformed by an expression she described as like watching a man realize he's already dead. From that point forward, subtle changes manifested. He continued working with the same efficiency, but overseers reported an unsettling quality to his compliance, a mechanical precision that felt more like counting down than cooperating. The head overseer noted in his daily log that Jacob had begun asking unusual questions about property boundaries, river depths, and distances to neighboring counties. Nothing overtly suspicious, but enough to raise vigilance. The other enslaved people began treating Jacob differently as well. Old Samuel, who'd lived at Harrington longer than anyone, told Martha that Jacob reminded him of something he'd witnessed once during a storm. The peculiar stillness before the sky turned green and the tornado came. Colonel Harrington, despite his reputation for attentiveness, seemed not to notice these subtle shifts. His attention that winter focused primarily on his eldest daughter's upcoming marriage, an alliance that would significantly expand his commercial connections. The wedding was planned for late spring. The plantation needed to present its most impressive face. The colonel ordered an expansion of the cotton press operation, requiring additional cleared land and new equipment installation. Jacob was assigned to lead this project, working alongside other men under the direct supervision of overseers. The work progressed steadily, but one day, exactly 1 week before the wedding, everything changed. The morning began unremarkably. Dawn arrived wrapped in thick fog from the river. The temperature was cold enough that breath showed white, but not cold enough to delay work. The plantation bell rang as it did every morning. Jacob reported to the cotton press area as required. The overseers carried their standard equipment. According to multiple testimonies compiled afterward, the trouble began in the morning, though accounts differ on the specific trigger. The official report states that Jacob refused a direct order, displaying open insubordination. Another written statement claims Jacob spoke disrespectfully when corrected for slow work. But Martha Clemens, who was collecting water from the nearby well, heard something else entirely. She later said she'd heard the head overseer announce that a letter had been intercepted, that its sender had been dealt with according to law, and that Jacob needed to understand the consequences of unauthorized correspondence. Whatever the actual catalyst, what happened next was witnessed by many people and documented in incident reports so disturbing that Colonel Harrington initially refused to file them with county authorities. The head overseer approached Jacob with a leather strap, standard procedure for even minor infractions. Jacob, who'd never previously resisted any form of punishment, didn't move. He was ordered to prepare himself. Jacob remained motionless, his eyes fixed on something in the distance, the direction of the river. The overseer struck him across the shoulders. Jacob didn't flinch. Another overseer moved to assist, grabbing Jacob's arm to force compliance. What happened then confused everyone present. The overseer later testified that grabbing Jacob's arm felt like gripping an oak beam. Jacob didn't pull away or struggle. He simply remained immobile while the overseer attempted to move him as if the normal mechanics of human leverage had ceased to function. A third overseer joined the effort. 3 men, all larger than average, accustomed to physical confrontation, attempting to move one person who was offering no active resistance, merely standing still and failing completely. The head overseer, his authority challenged before the entire work crew, fired his pistol into the air and shouted for additional help. The shot brought more overseers running from nearby areas. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the scene to an expanding audience of enslaved workers who'd stopped to watch. Multiple overseers surrounded Jacob. A clear order was issued: restrain him, and deliver punishment for insubordination. The men moved in simultaneously. What transpired over the next several minutes would be described in remarkably consistent terms by multiple witnesses, though none could adequately explain the mechanics of what they observed. The overseers attempted to force Jacob to the ground using standard techniques. Jacob didn't fight back in any conventional sense. He didn't throw punches or kicks. He didn't grab or push. He simply wouldn't go down. Witnesses described it as watching men trying to topple a tree that had decided not to fall. Every technique that should have worked produced no result. Jacob's knees didn't buckle. His balance didn't break. The fog had burned off completely now. The scene was occurring in full daylight before dozens of witnesses. The head overseer, desperate, sent a runner to fetch every available overseer on the plantation. Within minutes, many men had assembled, the largest concentration of authority figures most enslaved people on Harrington had ever seen in one place. Armed overseers against one unarmed man who still had not struck a single blow or made any aggressive movement. Colonel Harrington himself had been summoned and was approaching from the main house, his face dark with fury at this disruption so close to his daughter's wedding. The overseers coordinated their approach. This wasn't an act of punishment anymore. It had become a demonstration of power, a reassertion of the fundamental order that governed plantation society. If one man could resist many, the entire system faced an existential question. They rushed Jacob simultaneously from all sides. The sounds that followed, this detail appears in every written testimony, were wrong. Not the sounds of fighting, but of impact. Bone against bone, bodies hitting the ground with percussive force. Grunts of pain and shock. But these sounds came from the overseers, not from Jacob. When Colonel Harrington arrived at the scene, several overseers lay on the ground injured. One had a dislocated shoulder. Another's jaw was broken. A third was unconscious with a head wound. Another had suffered broken ribs. The remaining overseers had pulled back, forming a circle around Jacob, who stood in the center of the cleared space, breathing heavily but showing no other signs of the confrontation. The critical detail that appears in every account: Jacob hadn't thrown a single punch. The injuries had resulted from the overseers' own force being redirected, from collisions with each other, from failed takedown attempts that sent them sprawling. Several witnesses described it as watching men injure themselves against a wall that could think. Colonel Harrington drew his own pistol. The clearing went silent for a long moment. Witnesses estimated it at perhaps half a minute, though fear distorts time. Jacob and the colonel stared at each other. In that extended pause, something unspoken but clearly understood passed between them. The colonel's finger remained on the trigger. Jacob remained motionless, his expression unreadable. Then Jacob spoke, his voice carrying across the silent clearing with perfect clarity. Witnesses agreed on his words, though they disagreed on his tone. Some said it was flat and empty. Others said it held profound sorrow, and a few insisted it conveyed something close to pity. "I ain't here no more," Jacob said. "You might be looking at me, but I ain't here. I've been gone since that letter came." He turned then, not hurriedly, but with calm deliberation, and walked toward the tree line. The colonel shouted for the overseers to stop him. None moved. Jacob disappeared into the woods bordering the plantation's boundary. The fog had fully lifted by then. The morning was bright and clear, and Jacob Terrel, who many armed men had failed to restrain, was gone. The immediate aftermath of Jacob's departure created confusion that bordered on hysteria. Colonel Harrington ordered an immediate lockdown of the entire plantation. No one was permitted to leave their designated areas. The overseers, despite their injuries, were dispatched to search the woods and surrounding properties. Riders were sent to neighboring plantations with descriptions and warnings. The county sheriff was notified, and within hours, a formal pursuit had been organized involving men and dogs. But Jacob Terrel had vanished with a thoroughness that seemed impossible given the resources dedicated to finding him. The tracking dogs picked up his scent easily enough from the cotton press area, followed it into the woods, then abruptly lost it at the edge of a creek. This wasn't unusual. Water disrupts scent trails. What puzzled the trackers was that they couldn't pick up the trail on either bank, despite searching for miles in both directions. It was as if Jacob had stepped into the water and ceased to exist. The search continued for days. Patrols checked every known hiding place within a wide radius. They questioned enslaved people on neighboring plantations, offering rewards for information. They monitored roads, river crossings, and known routes toward free states. They found nothing. During those days, the atmosphere at Harrington Plantation transformed. The enslaved community, which had witnessed the confrontation, maintained absolute silence about Jacob's departure when questioned by authorities. But among themselves, according to accounts preserved decades later, they spoke of little else. Some expressed hope that Jacob had found freedom. Others feared terrible retribution when he was inevitably captured. A few shared rumors that Jacob had never intended to run at all, that he'd walked into those woods to die on his own terms, having finally broken under some unbearable psychological weight. The wedding proceeded as scheduled, though Colonel Harrington's demeanor during the festivities struck guests as distracted and tense. Several of the injured overseers were unable to attend due to their wounds. The celebration felt forced, servants later recalled. The head overseer, his shoulder still bound, submitted his resignation soon after. In his letter to Colonel Harrington, he wrote, "I can no longer in good conscience maintain discipline on this property. What I witnessed has led me to conclude that the foundations of our system contain flaws I had not previously recognized. I respectfully request immediate release from my duties." Another overseer resigned days later. His letter was shorter. "I cannot explain what happened. I will not try. I am going back." A third overseer, who'd been unconscious during the critical moments, remained at the plantation but began drinking heavily. Other enslaved people reported seeing him standing alone near the cotton press area at odd hours, staring into the woods where Jacob had disappeared, his expression haunted. Colonel Harrington initially refused to discuss the incident. When forced to provide information to county authorities, he submitted a minimal report describing Jacob as an escaped slave who exhibited unusual resistance to lawful restraint. He made no mention of the number of overseers, the injuries, or the specific circumstances of the confrontation. The report listed Jacob's physical description, estimated value, and offered a standard reward for his capture and return. But privately, the colonel began conducting his own investigation. He questioned everyone who'd known Jacob, trying to understand what he'd missed. He reviewed purchase records, work logs, any documentation that might explain what had transformed a supposedly compliant worker into someone capable of the resistance. His inquiries led him to the letter, the correspondence that had been mentioned. The colonel discovered that the truth was more disturbing than any rebellion. It was the realization that a human spirit, when it has decided it is already free, becomes impossible to contain. The system didn't fear Jacob's strength, it feared his absolute, unassailable withdrawal. He hadn't fought for his freedom that morning. He had simply demonstrated that, in his mind, he had already obtained it. And against that kind of certainty, no number of men, no amount of force, could ever truly prevail.